Welcome to the Major Projects Association podcast. I'm Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. I'm joined today by David Whitmore. Hello, David.
Hello, Andy.
So, David, we're going to talk about business-to-business relationships, and in particular, that in an inter-organisational project context. But before we get into the detail of our podcast today, perhaps you could just give an overview to our listeners in terms of your background and your specialisms.
So I guess there's still 40 years of experience into a 30-second summary. Particularly of interest to me at the moment is research into the delivery of major projects. But that comes on the back of a number of years of delivering major projects particularly in around the nuclear sector, but also in the defence area, civil areas and infrastructure sectors. So, lots of experience and hard knocks, I guess, from delivering major projects, but now very much focused on trying to understand how we can deliver them better.
Yeah, and it's you take an evidence-based approach and a research-based approach to looking at how we can deliver our major projects better. And we've had a chat before, but on the topic of collaboration, and the reason why we're having a chat today is you recently co-authored a new report, and rather than sort of the broad topic of collaboration, your report is entitled Business-to-Business Relationships and Inter-Organisational Projects. So before we get into the why and the who and the what of the report, perhaps we ought to just explain what we mean by business-to-business relationships and also what we mean by that inter-organisational project context.
Yeah, so for us, a business-to-business relationship is effectively any pseudo-commercial relationship between two organisations. So the two organisations is important because relationships can only exist between two entities. If you've got three or four, then you've got a number of relationships going on within that construct. And so a classic business-to-business relationship would be a client-to-supplier relationship, but it could equally be a client-to-regulator relationship. So it's not necessarily purely commercial organisations. And of course, business-to-business relationships exist in all walks of life, but our specific interest is in and around the major project area. So that's why we talk about inter-organisational projects. So when a project is of such a size that it can't be delivered by one organisation alone, then there's going to be multiple organisations and therefore inter-organisational relationships, which we think can have a dramatic effect on the success or failure of those projects.
Yeah. So is that leading into the why then? So why undertake this bit of research? What were you hoping to find?
The research we've looked at is quite broad around trying to answer the question, why is it that in the UK, the delivery performance of major projects appears to be deteriorating over the last, let's say, 25 years? And in looking at that, we've identified four areas that we think are having a dramatic impact on the ability to deliver those projects. And the reason why those four things are important is because we think that projects in the environment in which they're now delivered are far more complex than they ever used to be. And that means that these four aspects, and we talk about the level of digital integration, the level of modularity, and hence agility in delivery, the speed of decision-making, and then the business-to-business relationships or the impact of business-to-business relationships are the four things that we think are needed and need to be developed further to deal with the levels of complexity that we now find in our major projects. And of those four, we think the impact of business-to-business relationships is dominant because actually it affects the other three as well. So that's where we've started looking in real depth, and that was the motivation for doing the research.
So you've mentioned we a few times there. So it's not research you've done on your own. So who was involved? Who's the we in that case?
So principally, we see the best way to do this is as an industry academia collaboration, taking MIGSO-PCUBED, so the company that I work for, very large project management consultants operating on a global basis. We've got a large database of experience and obviously some opinions. but then linking that into what is one of the leading academic institutions looking in the infrastructure sector, and that's UCL. So principally, it's a collaboration between MIGSO-PCUBED and UCL. And the two profs at UCL, Ilias Kristalis and Martina Human. And working together, we've shaped the research to try and answer the question that's of real interest to us. So if we get it right, the academic research will feed into the learning and the development of the way we deliver major projects and the way we can help our clients in that respect.
Right, so there's that link between sort of academia and sort of studies and sort of what many of our members would class themselves as practitioners, so that we can take the learnings and apply them on current projects or future projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So it's one of 4 areas that you feel are critical for success of major projects today. So walk us through how you did the research and the findings that you've gleaned from it.
So taking that first area that we want to look at in real depth, and that's the impact of business-to-business relationships on inter-organisational projects, I guess you would say. We've taken an approach, and it's probably worth saying that actually we're building on prior research. So there was some research that was conducted in the early part of the century, which was looking at the impact of business-to-business relationships on business success. So not necessarily just projects, but any kind of business environment and where organisations collaborate, what's going on. So there's some, let's call it the original research, that gives us a framework for analysis. So we said, let's take that framework because we think it's the best that we've seen, and let's apply it to the specific case of major projects in the UK. And the way that works is to then find people who understand the issue, who are involved with those projects, and who have some level of reputation for being good at building relationships in those project environments. So basically, we've approached, I guess, largely at kind of senior exec level in the projects that we all know and love that are current in the UK, and actually some recently completed projects, which are particularly interesting because, of course, you've got the outcome, which the current projects don't yet have. So just the process of interviewing, using that research framework, and then doing lots of analysis to try and find how do those responses relate to the framework, where's the consistency, where's the differences, and what's interesting. So that's very much the academic piece, diving down into that analysis and then bringing it back up to reach some summary conclusions that we think should be important for everybody really involved in delivering those projects. And so we've spoken to project leaders, but we've also spoken to organisations that represent the industry, not least of which the Major Projects Association, of course, but also government, areas of government as well. So those parts of government that are responsible for the oversight of major projects, and also audit function within government, for example. So we've got a broad spectrum of views and opinions on how projects are delivered and why relationships are important.
So that range of those people, that sort of lived experience of trying to build these relationships and make them successful, to those that are like the auditors, the observers, and the commentators on what's been going on. One of the things that your report talks about quite early on is the distinction between sort of transactional relationships and strategic relationships, and it feels that's sort of quite a core element of how you want to go about building a relationship, depending upon the context of what you want to get from it. So perhaps we need to explore what we mean by those sort of, if they're either end of a spectrum or they're just different. What characterises the strategic relationship from the transactional one.
And that's a really important point. And actually, if I was to pick one thing that has come out of the conversations that we've had, then probably most striking is the degree of difference in understanding between transactional and strategic relationships and their value in different situations. Perhaps trying to summarise it. So we would describe a strategic relationship as something that's long-term where the objectives are aligned and incentives and risks are shared. A transactional relationship is something that's normally short-term, where there's a clear exchange of a product for a value or a service for a value. And again, the risks are not shared as such, but they're clearly delineated between the two parties involved in that transaction. What has been really interesting is, for many people, a transactional relationship is just another way of describing an adversarial relationship, and therefore, by implication, a strategic relationship is another way of describing a collaborative relationship. And we draw a clear distinction between those two things. So, in fact, you can have a highly collaborative transactional relationship and a highly adversarial strategic relationship. And we've seen examples of both, and they're fascinating. And there's a lot of talk around at the moment around Tideway, because it's a major project that has come in broadly on time and budget and has delivered a remarkable achievement in engineering terms. And yet I would describe that as a set of transactional relationships, but managed in a highly collaborative way. And I think that's really important, because we would describe the UK environment, commercial environment, as set up to be adversarial and transactional compared to other exemplar nations that we've looked at. And the easiest way to deal with that kind of environment, where it's about price, it's about competition, it's about demonstrating value for money, it's about ownership of risk. These are all transactional definitions. And actually, it may well be that the easiest way to deliver in the UK context is to build highly collaborative transactional relationships. That said, it's clear that successful strategic relationships in a complex environment can really outperform transactional relationships. But the level of effort needed from the leadership teams to build them and keep them strong in an environment that's trying to knock them back all the time is immense. And it's been a real privilege, actually, to talk to some of these people that are leading those strategic projects, relationships and projects, because they're truly inspirational. You know, they're on it all day, every day, making sure the relationships are functioning, because they know that is the best way to deal with the risks and the challenges that they will face. But many people underestimate how much personal effort at a leadership level they're going to have to put in to build a strategic relationship. And in that context, we might say, well, really think hard about going for a collaborative transactional approach, because that's, you know, the organisation will manage that, the environment will manage that for you. You're not an outlier all the time trying to be different, trying to be not in line with expected processes and procedures.
Yes, that's fascinating, because is it, well, I guess there could be an element of sort of just lazy language or use of language, where we might just say collaborative when we might be meaning strategic, and so it's just a clumsy choice of words. But that's quite insightful in terms of, you know, you can have highly collaborative transactional relationships and quite adversarial strategic relationships, because we often do associate collaborative with the more strategic one.
But by definition, there are some relationships. The reason you can have an adversarial strategic relationship is because you have no choice. So I won't use examples, but we can all think of examples where one organisation has to work with another organisation, because in the UK context, particularly in the defence sector, they're the only ones that do that, and they're the only ones that do that. So if you want to bolt one of them onto one of those, then those two organisations have got to work together. And if their relationship turns toxic over time, then that's an incredibly challenging environment to attempt to deliver something as complicated as a piece of defence capability, for example. So we do see them. And of course, the follow-on to that is there'll be another one, because they're the only two organisations, so they'll have to do it again for the next piece of equipment or the next service.
Yeah, and that's the fascinating bit about your definition of strategic being long term, because there's a sort of an implication of potentially being enduring as well. And obviously, the characteristic of a project is that it's temporary. There's a finite period, but some of our major projects, the duration of that finite period can perhaps in itself qualify something for being a long-term horizon. I guess depending upon the sort of planning horizon of the organisations involved. So, did you think about the relationship between that sort of long-term opportunity and effectively the one-off nature of an individual project?
That's a great point. And one of the key conclusions we reached was that there is almost an alignment. I mean, we wouldn't say this because we've not seen it. The evidence doesn't completely support it. But there's an alignment between strategic equals program, transactional equals project. And we would say, and one of the things we are saying to government is projects, one-off projects are really hard to build high-performing relationships on because you're constantly learning, but you don't have the chance to do that bit of the project again. So you're constantly learning, but you're trying to speculate how that might apply to the next stage of the project where other people come into play and different dynamics start to apply. But in programs, and this is where we've seen the really high-performing relationships, you can learn from project to project. And the examples we've looked at that are highly successful or successful strategic relationships, they can all be classed as programs. And when you dig into the detail, they'll tell you that the first couple of projects were a bit ropey actually and didn't go so well. But we stuck with it. We committed ourselves to it and we applied the learning. And the third project was great, and so on and so forth, till they almost become one of the programs we talked to described themselves as they didn't want to be performing, they wanted to be outperforming. So they were constantly outperforming. And again, we would say for single projects, major projects in a complex environment, transactional is probably your easiest way of managing that, but really collaborative. You can't overemphasize how collaborative that then has to be. And we've seen examples where in those collaborative transactional relationships, the risk ownership is clearly defined, but the client is clear that if the risk becomes too much for the contractor to manage, they will at that point take that risk back and they will create an environment of innovation and collaboration to try and find what's the best solution to this problem we've got ourselves into. And then they'll reallocate the risk after having gone through that review. Whereas, of course, in an adversarial transactional relationship, you would just chase the supplier harder and harder with more and more lawyers to make sure they performed, but also that they bore the full cost for it, which may at some point become unsustainable for them.
Yeah, and then the challenges may then fall back to the client organisation anyway, even after they've been pursued for damages or costs. So is that in that spectrum then from sort of strategic at one end to the transactional at the other, is that risk reward element a key differentiator between the two?
Yeah. So in the original research, it defined 7 dimensions of a relationship. And for each of those 7 dimensions, there is a striking difference between a transactional model and a strategic model. And actually, there is no spectrum. So you can either be transactional or strategic. You can't become better and better at being transactional until you eventually become strategic, because the two things are completely separate in the way they're managed. So
they're states effectively then, rather than that.
Yeah. There's the states. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we think it's a key management decision to decide whether you should best use a transactional model or a strategic model for all the critical relationships that are going to affect the outcome of the project. And of course, we've seen this in the past. I mean, Terminal 5 at Heathrow was an example of adapting the contract model to the type of relationship between the supplier and and the contractor or the client, depending on where in the supply chain it was. But yeah, if you take an example, then in one of those dimensions is the selection of the partner. And in the transactional model, that will be done classically through competition. It will be done by assessing a number of bids on the basis of time and cost and quality, capability, and so on, the normal things that you would expect to see in a traditional tender, and then having a period of negotiation and appointing the preferred supplier with clear delineation of risk and reward. In the strategic model, and this is where it gets difficult for the UK environment, because in the strategic model, competition is a problem, and hence the reason why programs can be more successful and the first couple of projects might struggle. But in other countries, Japan, for example, the supply chain just exists and it doesn't change from project to project. And the relationships are strong and long term. Doesn't mean they're not tough, and they can still be quite challenging. But the selection of the partner is, well, we're building this, so we use them, and that's the way it works. And of course, in the UK, we used to have a similar model because, and this is perhaps crossing into the arena of politics, and I don't really want to go there, but when we used to have national delivery bodies, so we had a central electricity generating board that would build all the nuclear reactors, and they had a supply chain that didn't change very much from reactor to reactor. So you didn't have to decide who was going to lead that delivery on your behalf. It was there, and we had those national delivery bodies. But obviously, in the mid-80s, they all kind of evaporated in the theory that value for money could be demonstrated through competition, and therefore we needed a market with a number of options in it, leading us to the kind of model that we have now. So that's just an example. In partner selection, transactional is kind of what we see most of the time in the UK, whereas strategic is more, we built this delivery model for the long term, and therefore we don't need to keep recompeting and reselecting. It just goes on and on. Maybe that's where we're touching on the project delivery partner model a little bit in that strategic.
Yeah, we'll move on to that in a moment. But one of the things that interests me is when you've got two organisations, one believes they're acting strategically, and the other one behaves transactionally. So you've got this mismatch of responses from one to the other. And we had a case recently in one of our member events where the client was involved in, let's call it not first of a kind, but first of a new generation, or the first of the next kind. And then when they went out to the market, they're asking for the supplier's best price, for the first of a series of this next generation. And the market saying, hang on a minute, this is the first time, so we can't possibly give a best price on this one. You need to give us the opportunity to fail and experiment and so on. Maybe the second and third and the fourth, we can start getting to a best price. And it felt to me that in the way that you were describing the program versus project, there was a mismatch there between sort of thinking strategically longer term, but still behaving transactionally on the first time they commercially engage with the market.
I would say you've nailed it, actually. It's almost as if you were sitting in on most of the interviews that...
Well, maybe it was the same person that raised the discussion.
But one thing we found was that people would talk strategically about the need for the relationships to be managed in a strategic way. But then when we asked for examples of how they were actually managed, they were quite often managed in a transactional way, because that's simply the way their business was set up to deal with contracts and suppliers. And I can kind of relate to your story there, because I've got quite a unique example, I guess, from my own experience, where many years ago I was working in Rolls-Royce submarines, and I was in charge of putting into the market a new set of what we called strategic relationships for technical support partners. And so we went through that process, and we selected a couple of companies, NNC, which is probably part of Jacobs now, effectively, but and Atkins Realis as his name, and sure enough, having put a strategic relationship in place, our procurement team proceeded to act in an entirely transactional way with Atkins, demanding the normal monthly progress updates and cost and time metrics and so on and so forth. And this just confused Atkins. They didn't understand how the senior level rhetoric was, this is a strategic relationship. Please build your capability. We will give you the work. You are here now for the long term. To then our day-to-day response, which was, can you please explain why you overspent by 5K on this particular project, which should have been delivered by this time and it was 3 days late? And then later on, I actually left Rolls-Royce and joined Atkins. And so I got the inside story from both camps. And it was quite a traumatic experience for them because they wanted to talk to our senior directors and, they thought they would be brought in to helping us shape a strategic vision and so on and so forth. But all they were getting was relatively junior supply engineers, as they were called, asking them for detailed reports that explained why they'd overspent. So, and I think you do see that quite often where we're going to be strategic. And I think this is why you need those inspirational individuals who just stay on top of it all the time, because the individual organisations will try and revert to the learned experience of how you manage an NEC contract, for example. And this individual keeps coming in and says, no, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this way because it's a strategic relationship. And quite often that person doesn't exist and they do revert to type, and then it becomes very odd.
And there's some of that to do with coming back to, again, thinking about the terminology. So if we've got a transactional relationship, there needs to be something that we transact on. So typically, if I was the contractor supplier, then I would provide a unit of or a thing, and the delivery and the acceptance of that thing would then equate to a payment or an invoice that then gets paid or reward of some form. But it's very easy to prove, isn't it? Ought to be easy to prove. I've delivered something. It's got we've got an agreed fee for it, and therefore there's no dispute over what I should be paid for it. On the strategic relationship, I'm assuming that it's less, it's more difficult to pin the reward on something that's that's that black or white. So there's not a transaction that you can relate a fee to. So did that play out in sort of the commercial contract forms that you were looking at?
Yes, it did. And in the models that were the most effective, because the objectives were aligned. So if we take East West Rail Phase 2, which was one of the projects we felt was an exemplar project in terms of the way it managed relationships and broadly successful outcomes. The objectives of both organisations were to build that stretch or to upgrade that stretching line between Oxford and Cambridge for this much by that time. So there was a transactional element in there, but the reward to the alliance was from the successful delivery of the rail capability. So clearly within that, there were lots of things that the alliance was delivering to Network Rail, but the reward was based on the progress on the project. So, and in that case as well, it was also the contract form was a version of the pure alliance model, which deep in the mist of time started in the North Sea and then went on extended holiday to Australia, recently to return to the UK for projects like the Stafford Area Improvement Programme and Sellafield. Well, actually, perhaps not Sellafield PPP. In the end, I think they went down the NEC approach. But then we've also seen people try to use the NEC contract form, both in its alliance form and its engineering contract form, and then heavily amend it to try and build the relational factors into it that they believe they need for the project to be successful. And I think that's quite difficult. And I think one of the recommendations we would say is if you want to go down the strategic approach, think bespoke contracts. It's going to be supportive of what you're trying to do, whereas things like NEC have got things buried in them that are inherently transactional and will come back and bite you at some point in the future. So the ones we've seen that have really, the contractors really just pushed them in the right direction all the time have been bespoke contracts or highly relational models like the pure alliance.
Yeah, and there's often not a fear, or maybe it is a fear of going down that bespoke contract of them being expensive to set up and then maintain and then to execute. Whereas I think what you're saying is if it's just the wrong one, I guess you end up having a higher cost anyway of trying to shoehorn a transactional, oriented contract into a form where you're expecting it to be more strategic.
And they become incredibly difficult to read. And one of the other dimensions that we talk about, these 7 dimensions, is dealing with problems. And in many cases, some of the not so good examples, they rely on the contract to help them deal with problems. Whereas in the more relational ones, they've got specific processes set up for this is how we will collaborate to deal with problems and use innovation as a tool to solve the problem. And when you force back into the contract, and you've got an NEC contract that actually the Z clause is a bigger section of the resulting contract than the actual main body, so-called main body of the contract. But now you're trying to read the original clause as modified by the Z clause and maybe by other sort of letters that have been put on record, for example. It becomes incredibly difficult to understand exactly what you thought you were going to do when you agreed the contract. Whereas, of course, with a bespoke contract, you don't have that series of modifications to try and stitch together.
Yeah, I've had that experience of the long list of Z clauses, and even with one client organisation where I was embedded, where their standard contract had lots of Z clauses, and what we found there was that our potential market was forever shrinking as contractors over time decided that they were too onerous to be worthy to even pursue. So it actually reduced competition because of the number of Z clauses we're having in our standard contract. We mentioned delivery partner. So this is a shameless plug in that we have our delivery partner event coming up on the 6th of November. So clearly there's a relationship between the research that you've been doing in terms of that business to business relationships in that inter-organisational project, and the very presence of a delivery partner means you've got an inter-organisational project. So did your research draw out any findings in terms of those inter-organisational projects that tend to set up that strategic relationship approach and the presence of delivery partners or not?
It did, because some of the projects that looked at were effectively using a delivery partner model. Sellafield, PPP, project and program partners, for example. And I think the findings from the research should be really helpful to people setting up a project delivery partner model. And it's perhaps worth saying about this paper. So what the paper does is in going through the research, we found 4 programs, let's call them that kept getting referred to as we think these are exemplars of the way to use relationships to deliver project success. We've already mentioned some of those. So East-West Rail Phase 2, Sellafield Project and Programme Partners, Anglian at One Alliance was a striking example of how that is done. And then in terms of the delivery of the individual projects, the Smart Motorways programme, again and again, they got referred back to. So we dug deeper into those 4 programmes. And what we present in the research is what was consistent about what they did in those 4 programmes that made them different from a standard, let's call it a standard approach. And we found actually striking consistency between them. And when we dug a little deeper, we found out that actually there was people moving from one programme to the other, and they were sharing things through organisations like MPA, like Project 13 and so on. So there was actually a dialogue going on between those programmes. So what we capture in the paper are a number of findings that we think can really help people setting up a integrator model, a program delivery partner model to think about. This is what they did in those 4 projects that focused on relationships and are going well or have done well. Think about those in relation to your program. And it's things like, pragmatic things like, don't underestimate the amount of time this will take, because what we found in all 4 programs was the senior leaders put vast amounts of effort into shaping the relationships to more kind of pragmatic, process-based approaches, such as the dealing with problems. Make sure you have a problem-solving process that builds on innovation and collaboration between the various parties involved. So yeah, I think we didn't specifically say for a project delivery partner or program delivery partner we would say do this, but I think there's definitely a checklist there that we've distilled down what was making a difference in what we currently see as the best practice projects, and they can be really insightful for how you want to go about your program delivery partner model.
And is there anything in your research that talked about how the organisations handle that they've got to operate both strategically and transactionally on the same project? Because you talked right at the beginning that it's a two organisation context, so because that's the commercial relationship between the two. But if you're the delivery partner, for example, there will be other organisations involved with the project that you have a relationship with, but those can be really transactional. But the one with the key partner, the client in the project is a strategic one, and that's perhaps quite difficult to switch between one type of relationship with one organisation and a different type of relationship with others.
Yeah, and we do recommend that the first place to start is to look at your, let's call it the relationship map. So for my project, this is the relationship map. I'm going to have to establish a relationship with all of these organisations and into the supply chain as well, because there might be some critical capabilities sitting in the supply chain. And the best approach to them is either going to be to form a strategic relationship or to manage them in a transactional way. There's no middle ground. That's one of the things we found. So it's one or
I've learned that, no spectrum.
and there can't be many strategic ones because they take a vast amount of resource to keep on top of and to manage effectively. And so how do you balance the risk? Which approach is going to give you the lowest risk in terms of a relationship causing an impact on the project? So we talk about building a heat map of all the relationships that are affecting your project, looking at the ones that are going to be the riskiest, making sure that it's clear whether it's going to go down a strategic model or a transactional model, and then putting the contracts and the processes in place to make sure that that is how they're managed in practice. So, and you might not be surprised at this, I guess, Andy, because obviously a large part of our business is providing project management offices, but we think this should be the new project management office capability. The analysis of relationships, the risk assessment of relationships, and the decision of what processes to apply to different relationships is a PMO function from our perspective. And we think that every complex project should have that function built into its PMO.
And it also feels that there's a shift here from being implicit to explicit about it as well, and being really clear with each party what's the nature of your relationship.
Yeah, and I think actually something that came out of the original research, it wasn't something that we concluded from the work that we did, but there's this aspect of there's an element of education in the senior leader community. And the way it was phrased at the time was most senior leaders of projects find themselves in that position through either a engineering, legal, or financial background. That's the experience they bring to the table. They tend not to have come from a behavioural psychology or behavioural economics type background. But really, this idea of using relationships to shape the project economy, I suppose, and microeconomy in your project, is very much behavioural economics. And so there's a skill set there that needs to be added. And so we think there's kind of executive education piece there as well, so that people just see this as it's not soft and fluffy and something that I just need to manage because I'm really good at managing interpersonal relationships. It is actually something that's analytical and can be planned for and developed and implemented in the same way as any other aspect of the program.
Yes, if you're bringing in that behavioural economics, I guess you can even apply game theory to model, the likely performance or outcomes of particular approaches to to the scenarios, like the dealing the problems, for example. Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
that's not a soft skill in the or behavioural skill. That is a very analytical, technical skill to use.
And we would say that's part of the risk assessment. So actually, what is it in these relationships that might cause them to fragment? And so what you're looking for is the ones that could fragment and could fragment suddenly, because those are the ones that are going to be really dangerous. And those are the ones where you need to devote more time and effort. So, yeah, I mean, it is highly analytical, but senior leaders with the right level of knowledge and understanding, and then a genuine intuitive feel. I mean, that's one of the things that came through from talking to people who were sort of recommended to us as exemplars in this was, they had a real intuitive feel for it. And we saw some projects, I won't name them, but where the replacement of one senior exec with another transformed the relationships in the projects. And that was, we would say that was because the first person that was there had an intuitive feel for it. They didn't have the processes and analytics that we're proposing, but they had an intuitive feel for it, and the person that came in afterwards didn't. Or vice versa, actually. We saw one case where the opposite happened.
So it feels like every project leader that's involved in an enduring project should definitely follow the link that we'll put in the show notes for today to look at not just this particular one, but the 4 elements and then the 7 dimensions that you cover. So what's next on this, David? It feels like there's a follow-up piece of research, or this is just one in a journey of studies that you're doing in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the field of research is quite enlightening to me, and it is a never-ending quest. I think that's one of the things that I've discovered, because in classic fashion, you attempt to answer one question and find 3 more. So we've got a plan, and we're halfway through the next stage of the research, which is asking the question, because we got the original research from 20 years ago, we can ask the question, how have relationships changed in the UK over the last 20 years? Have they got more collaborative, more adversarial, more transactional, more strategic? What's happened to those relationships over that period of time? So that's the next one. We also want to look much deeper into what's going on in other countries. So we've used Japan as our reference case, and we would like to look deeper into how those relationships are formed using our framework, how they're formed, how they're maintained in Japan, possibly China. Countries that people would point to and say have a more successful track record in delivery of major projects, and see if we can draw distinct differences in the way those relationships are formed and managed. So that's definitely on the cards. There's a couple of other angles that we might look into. I'm very interested in people's views on what would be useful. But then, of course, we've got 3 other areas to dig into as well, because we said there's 4 things that will help to deal with the level of environmental complexity in the UK, and we're sort of 1/3 of the way through one of those. So I can see it's, I'm kind of sort of in retirement, but I can see a whole sort of career ahead of me in hacking through those various questions.
Your best years in terms of impact on the profession might still be ahead of you. So
could well be. Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So, as I said, we will put links to the research so that listeners can find it. We'll also put the shameless plug for the event coming up, which I think is almost full anyway. But we'll also be doing a follow-up from the delivery partner event. But this has been a fantastic warm-up, and hopefully it's whetted our appetites to think about the delivery partner in the context of the business-to-business relationships, plural, that need to be in place. The best way to characterise that is the relationship from your organisation to another one, or between 2, as you said right at the beginning. And don't think of it as a spectrum, but which one of these 2 are you in? And if you're in the transactional one, then you need to enhance your collaborative capability. If you're in the strategic one, I don't think you're advocating it needs to be adversarial, but it needs a lot more effort and energy and time put into making sure those relationships work. And I feel like I've done an injustice to your research there, but there's a lot more insights and findings from it too. So please do follow up on it. David, as ever, I really enjoy our chats, and no doubt we'll have another one coming along on this topic in the future. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Andy. No, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.